They called him the devil's own shadow, a 130-pound pit bull that terrified even the hardest, blood-tested enforcers of the Hells Angels. He was a ticking time bomb wrapped in muscle and scar tissue. But when the heavy steel chain finally snapped, it wasn't a patched biker who stopped the impending slaughter. It was a starving 9-year-old girl in a dirty t-shirt. The clubhouse for the Oakland chapter of the Hells Angels wasn't just a building, it was a fortress. Tucked away behind corrugated steel fences and reinforced cinder-block walls, it was a place where the laws of the city ended and the laws of the club began. The air permanently smelled of exhaust, stale beer, and sun-baked asphalt. The men who populated this fortress were not easily frightened. They had survived prison riots, highway shootouts, and decades of brutal gang warfare. But every single one of them walked a wide, cautious circle around a dog named Havoc. Havoc was a pit bull mastiff mix, a gargantuan creature bred in the darkest corners of an illegal underground fighting ring in Stockton. His coat was a mottled, bruised brindle, marred by thick, hairless streaks of pink scar tissue. His left ear was completely gone, ripped away in some forgotten battle, leaving only a jagged hole. But it was his eyes that unsettled the seasoned bikers. When Havoc looked at you, he didn't see a companion. He saw a threat, a target, or a meal. Arthur Iron. Dempsey, a towering 6'4" enforcer with a rap sheet as long as Interstate 5, was the dog's legal owner. Dempsey had found Havoc during a raid on a rival drug den 3 years prior. The dog had been chained to a radiator, starved, beaten, and left to guard a stash of cash. Dempsey, a man who rarely showed mercy to humans, saw a reflection of his own violent, incarcerated youth in the broken animal. He put a bullet in the ceiling to scatter the rival dealers, unchained the beast, and brought him back to Oakland. It was a mistake. You can take the dog out of the fighting pit, but scraping the pit out of the dog proved impossible. Dempsey thought he could rehabilitate Havoc with loyalty and a heavy hand, but Havoc recognized no master. He was purely reactive, driven by a deeply ingrained PTSD that made him unpredictable and violently explosive. The incidents began piling up. First, it was a local mechanic named Gary who came to fix the club's ice machine. Gary dropped a wrench. The metallic clatter echoed sharply against the concrete. In a flash of brindle fury, Havoc tore through his tether and latched onto Gary's steel-toed boot, crushing the reinforced leather like tin foil. It took 3 grown men hitting the dog with 2x4s to break his jaws lock. Gary walked with a limp for the rest of his life, and the club paid him $10,000 in silent, untraceable cash to never speak of it. Then it was one of their own. Billy Toad Jenkins, a young prospect trying to earn his full patch, made the mistake of walking too close to Havoc's food bowl while the dog was eating. Havoc didn't just growl, he launched himself. He caught Toad by the forearm, dragging the 200-pound man across the gravel yard like a rag doll. Dempsey himself had to choke the dog out to the point of unconsciousness to save Toad's arm from being amputated by the dog's teeth. The atmosphere inside the clubhouse grew tense. The Hells Angels operated on strict codes of brotherhood and safety within their walls. The wooden gavel struck the heavy oak table. "Iron, we love you, brother," spoke the chapter president, a grizzled man named Clayton. "But that beast out there is a liability. He's gonna kill a civilian, or worse, he's gonna kill a kid walking past the gate. You know what happens then? The police, the feds, the news vans. We can't have that kind of heat. The dog has to be put down by Monday. Dempsey sat in stone-cold silence. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. He didn't argue. He knew Clayton was right. Havoc was a loaded gun with a hair trigger, and the safety was permanently broken. "I'll handle it," Dempsey muttered, his voice gravelly and devoid of emotion. He had 48 hours to put a bullet in the only living thing he felt he genuinely understood. But fate, operating in the grimy shadows of the Oakland streets, had a different timeline. Just outside the fortified perimeter of the Hells Angels clubhouse, past the chain-link fence topped with razor wire, sat an abandoned, rusted 1906 Chevy conversion van. It had 4 flat tires and a shattered windshield covered by a moldy blue tarp. For the past 6 months, this decrepit shell had been home to a 9-year-old girl named Harper. Harper was a ghost in her own city. Her mother, deeply lost in the unforgiving grip of a fentanyl addiction, would vanish for days at a time, leaving Harper to fend for herself. The girl was painfully thin, her collarbones sharp against the collar of a faded oversized Looney Tunes t-shirt. She survived by a set of strict self-imposed rules: stay invisible, never make eye contact, and scavenge only when the sun was coming up. Despite the intimidation they projected, Harper felt a strange sense of security living next to the biker club. The heavy gates, the loud motorcycles, and the imposing men meant that the usual street predators, the dealers and thieves who preyed on the homeless, stayed far away from the alley. She spent hours peeking through a small rust hole in the corrugated fence, watching the bikers clean their Harley-Davidsons. And she watched Havoc. Unlike the men who viewed the dog as a monster, Harper watched the pit bull with a quiet, observant intensity. She noticed things the bikers missed. She noticed that Havoc didn't bark at the birds that landed near his bowl. He ignored them. She noticed that he only paced the length of his heavy chain when the wind blew the scent of burning garbage from the nearby industrial park. Most importantly, she noticed the way he flinched. Whenever Dempsey yelled or a motorcycle backfired violently, Havoc didn't look aggressive first. He looked terrified. His ears would pin flat to his scarred skull, his tail would tuck sharply between his hind legs, and then the teeth would come out. The aggression wasn't born of malice. Harper knew that sequence perfectly. It was the exact same sequence her mother went through when she was coming down from a high, and the same sequence Harper herself felt when a stranger approached the van. It was the desperate, terrifying instinct of cornered prey pretending to be a predator. It was Tuesday morning, the day after Dempsey had agreed to put the dog down. The Oakland heat was already oppressive by 10,000 a.m., baking the asphalt and making the air shimmer. Dempsey had tied Havoc to a massive rusted tractor axle in the center of the yard while he went inside to retrieve his .45 caliber pistol. This was the day. Outside the gates, a young, nervous delivery driver named Dale was dropping off a parcel of heavy mechanics tools. Dale was sweating profusely, intimidated by the leather-clad men and the deafening roar of a motorcycle engine being revved in the adjacent garage. Suddenly, a police cruiser sped down San Pablo Avenue. It wasn't coming for the club, but the rookie cop behind the wheel hit his siren just as he passed the clubhouse to clear an intersection. The piercing, high-decibel whoop-whoop ripped through the muggy air. For Havoc, that sound was a direct trigger to the raid that had nearly killed him 3 years ago. The screaming, the flashbangs, the blood. With a sound like tearing metal, Havoc lunged forward with everything he had. The rusted carabiner connecting his chain to the axle, weakened by years of rain and tension, shattered. The heavy steel chain whipped through the air, completely disconnected from the axle. Havoc was loose. Silence slammed into the yard heavier than the heat. The revving motorcycle died instantly. 4 bikers in the yard froze, their hands hovering over the hunting knives on their belts. Havoc didn't run away. Disoriented and flooded with blind panic, his amber eyes locked onto the first movement he saw. Dale, the delivery driver who had just dropped his clipboard in sheer terror. Dale scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing hard onto the cracked sidewalk just outside the open front gate. He drew his hands up over his face, screaming as the 130-pound wall of muscle and teeth bore down on him. Dempsey burst through the clubhouse doors, his 145 pistol drawn. "No!" he bellowed, raising the weapon. But the angle was impossible. The dog and the driver were moving too fast, and firing meant risking a ricochet into Dale. Bloodshed was inevitable. Until a tiny figure slipped through the gap in the corrugated fence. Harper didn't run. She didn't scream. Moving with an eerie, unnatural calmness born from a life of navigating violent adults, the 9-year-old girl stepped directly between the screaming delivery man and the charging beast. "Hey," she said. He aimed his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger, his mind screaming at the horror of what was about to happen. A child was about to be torn to pieces in front of his eyes. Havoc was only 5 feet away from her, closing the distance in a fraction of a second. But Harper didn't brace for impact. Instead, she dropped straight to her knees, making herself completely small. She tucked her chin to her chest, averted her eyes to the dirt, and held out one open, empty, trembling palm. It was the universal language of complete surrender. Havoc hit the brakes. His massive, clawed paws tore into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust as he skidded to a halt mere inches from Harper's face. The dog was panting heavily, frothing at the mouth, his chest heaving like bellows. The thick steel chain trailed behind him, clinking softly against the gravel. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody in the yard moved. The delivery driver was sobbing on the ground. Dempsey's gun wavered in the air, his fingers sweating on the trigger, completely paralyzed by the impossibility of the scene. Havoc lowered his massive, blocky head. He let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated in Harper's chest. She kept her eyes glued to the dirt, her hand extended. "It's loud," Harper whispered to the dog, her voice soft, steady, and devoid of fear. "I know it's loud. You're okay." Slowly, the growl stopped. The frantic heaving of Havoc's chest began to slow. He stepped forward, his wet nose pressing against Harper's frail, dirty palm. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the street, the dirt, and the overwhelming, undeniable absence of threat. In front of a gang of the most hardened criminals in Oakland, the devil's own shadow let out a soft whine, sank onto his haunches, and rested his massive scarred chin directly onto the lap of the homeless 9-year-old girl. The silence in the yard was absolute, broken only by the ragged sobbing of the delivery driver, Dale, who was still curled in a fetal position on the sweltering concrete outside the gate. Arthur Iron Dempsey stood frozen, his heavy .45 caliber pistol still suspended in the air. The weapon felt like a block of lead in his trembling grip. He had been a fraction of a second away from putting a hollow point bullet into his dog and risking the life of a child in the process. Slowly, deliberately, Dempsey lowered the barrel toward the dirt and clicked the safety back into place. The metallic snick echoed loudly. The gargantuan pit bull remained firmly planted in the dust, his massive scarred head resting heavily in Harper's lap. The girl's small, dirt-streaked hand rhythmically stroked the thick, hairless ridges of pink scar tissue behind the dog's missing ear. She was humming, a quiet, tuneless vibration that seemed to anchor the beast's erratic heartbeat. Clayton, the chapter president, pushed his way through the heavy oak doors of the clubhouse. He had heard the commotion from the back office. Taking in the scene, the broken chain, the fleeing delivery man, Dempsey's drawn weapon, and the impossible tableau of the homeless child and the club's monster. Iron Clayton rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. Iron Clayton rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. What the hell is happening out here? Dempsey didn't answer immediately. He holstered his weapon and took a slow, measured step forward. Havoc's golden eyes snapped open, locking onto Dempsey. A low warning vibration began in the dog's throat, but Harper gently tapped his snout. Shh, she murmured. It's okay, he said, not mean. Havoc exhaled a long breath through his nose and closed his eyes again, ignoring his owner entirely. Dempsey stopped 6 feet away and dropped to one knee, putting himself at eye level with the 9-year-old. Up close, the reality of her condition was a gut punch. Her clothes were stiff with days of grime, her sneakers were held together with gray duct tape, and dark purple bags hung heavily under her hollow eyes. Yet she looked back at the towering tattooed enforcer without a shred of intimidation. "Where did you come from, kid?" Dempsey asked, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. Harper didn't speak, although, would a. She simply raised one thin arm and pointed a dirty finger toward the rusted corrugated metal fence, specifically toward the gap near the abandoned 1996 Chevy conversion van. Clayton signaled to 2 of his prospects, a pair of burly men named Thomas and Wyatt. "Go check it out," he ordered. The 2 men jogged over to the fence, slipping through the gate. Less than a minute later, Thomas returned, his face pale beneath his heavy beard. He looked sick. "President," Thomas said, his voice hushed so the girl couldn't hear. "You need to see this. It's bad." Clayton and Dempsey left the yard, walking over to the abandoned van. The smell hit them before they even pulled back the moldy blue tarp covering the shattered windshield. It was the distinct odor of human neglect, spoiled food, damp mildew, and unwashed clothes. Inside the sweltering rusted shell lay a stained mattress on the metal floor. Scattered around it were dozens of empty baked bean cans, a few scavenged plastic water bottles, and a ratty child's sleeping bag. There were no parents. Haven't seen an adult around this heap in weeks. Thought it was just a junkie drop. The men stood in silence. The hypocrisy of their violent lives was suddenly glaring. They possessed millions of dollars in motorcycles and clubhouse renovations, while a starving child lived in a rusted metal box 10 feet from their property line. I know, Dempsey replied. He looked at the beast, then at the fragile girl. But look at him, Clay. He's not a killer right now. He's just broken. Like her. A clubhouse full of felons is no place for a little girl, Arthur. And I will not hand her over to Child Protective Services so she can get lost in the system and abused in some overcrowded foster home. You know how that goes. We both do. He was a meat grinder that produced either corpses or criminals. They were the latter. My sister Margaret, Dempsey said suddenly. She lives out in Walnut Creek. She's a pediatric nurse. Good house, big yard. She's been trying to adopt for years, but the agencies dragged their feet because of my last name. We take the kid there. Clayton considered it. And the dog? Dempsey looked at Havoc. Where she goes, he goes. I think they just claimed each other. Connie considered it. But before they could orchestrate this transition, the brutal reality of Harper's past was about to violently collide with the present. The streets of Oakland rarely relinquished their hostages without a fight. It took 4 days to get Margaret cleared to take Harper on an emergency, temporary basis, utilizing a high-priced club lawyer who knew how to fast-track private guardianship petitions. The transformation within the walls was surreal. Hardened bikers, Men who had done hard time in San Quentin were suddenly watching their language. The club's bartender, an older woman named Samantha, scrubbed Harper in the industrial sink, throwing away her filthy clothes and outfitting her in fresh jeans and a small, oversized Hell's Angels support hoodie. And Havoc was a completely different animal. He refused to let Harper out of his sight. When she ate at the long oak table, Havoc sat silently at her feet, ignoring the steaks the prospect tried to toss him. When she slept on the leather sofa in Dempsey's office, the 130-pound pit bull curled his massive body around hers, acting as a living, breathing, heavily muscled blanket. He didn't growl. He didn't flinch. The PTSD that had driven his violent outbursts was entirely neutralized by her calm, steady presence. She was his anchor in a terrifying world. On the 5th day, a Friday afternoon, Dempsey was packing Harper's new clothes into a duffel bag, preparing to drive her to Margaret's house in Walnut Creek. Harper was sitting in the yard with Havoc, tossing a crushed tennis ball. The dog would lumber after it, gently pick it up, and trot back, dropping it in her lap. The heavy iron gates at the front of the property were rolled open to allow Thomas to back his truck in. A sleek black Cadillac Escalade pulled up sharply to the curb, blocking the driveway. 3 men stepped out. They wore expensive sneakers, designer denim, and heavy gold chains. They were enforcers for a local drug syndicate, a ruthless crew that ran the fentanyl trade in the East Bay. The leader, a wiry, volatile man named Rick Stanton, took a drag from a cigarette and stared through the open gates. Well, well, Rick smirked, his voice carrying over the idle of Thomas's truck. Look who we have here, little Lisa's kid. At the sound of the strange voice, Havoc froze, his ears pinned back, and the hair along his spine stood up in a rigid, razor-sharp line. A low, thunderous rumble started in his chest. Harper immediately put a hand on his neck. Stay, she whispered. Thomas stepped out of his truck, crossing his arms over his burly chest. You boys are lost. Back that imported piece of trash out of our driveway. Rick flicked his cigarette onto the pavement. Not lost, Giant. We're looking for Lisa. She owes my boss 30 grand. She skipped town. But I see she left her insurance policy behind. He pointed a bony finger at Harper. We're taking the kid. Lisa will come crawling back with the cash when she realizes we have her brat. Rick took a step onto the Hells Angels property. It was a fatal miscalculation. In a matter of seconds, the clubhouse doors flew open. Dempsey, Clayton, and 6 other fully patched members spilled into the yard. They didn't run. They walked with the terrifying predatory calmness of men deeply accustomed to violence. They formed a solid human wall between the syndicate men and the little girl. I suggest you turn around, Stanton, Clayton said smoothly, recognizing the enforcer. Before you do something that gets you buried under the new interstate overpass. Rick sneered, pulling back his jacket to reveal a 9mm pistol tucked into his waistband. This isn't club business, Clayton. It's cartel business. Give me the girl. She is club business now, Dempsey growled, stepping forward, his sheer size dwarfing the syndicate enforcer. She didn't have to. Havoc perceived the threat to his pack. The dog bypassed the stay command, reverting to the lethal training bred into his bones. But this time it was guided by absolute clarity. Havoc moved faster than the human eye could track. He was a 130-pound blur of brindle muscle. He didn't attack Rick's throat or face. He launched himself horizontally, his massive jaws clamping down directly on Rick's gun hand. The sickening crunch of shattering bone echoed through the yard. Rick screamed, a high, piercing sound of absolute agony, as the pistol clattered uselessly onto the concrete. Havoc hit the ground, dragging the enforcer down with him, locking his jaw completely and violently shaking his head. Rick's two goons panicked, reaching for their own weapons, but they were entirely outmatched. Dempsey and Thomas were on them in a heartbeat, fists flying with devastating, heavy impacts, knocking both men unconscious before they could even draw their guns. Rick was thrashing on the ground, shrieking for mercy as the beast crushed his wrist into powder. Havoc's amber eyes were wild, the adrenaline of the fight surging through him. He was seconds away from tearing the man's arm from its socket. Havoc? The voice was tiny, shrill, and completely devoid of fear. Harper ran forward, pushing past Dempsey's legs. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around the dog's thick, muscular neck, burying her face into his scarred coat. "Drop it," she yelled, her voice breaking. "Drop it, Havoc, now." For a terrifying second, the dog held fast, locked in the red mist of violence. But then, feeling the familiar frail arms around his neck, the tension drained from his jaw. He released Rick's pulverized hand, took a step back, and immediately sat down next to Harper, letting out a sharp, protective bark, before turning to lick a smear of dirt off the girl's cheek. The yard descended into silence once more, save for Rick's pathetic whimpering. Clayton walked over, kicking the dropped 9mm away. He looked down at the syndicate enforcer. "You tell your boss that Lisa's debt is canceled. If any of your crew ever looks at this girl or this clubhouse again, we won't just break your hands. We will burn your entire operation to the ground. Now get off my property." The message was clear. The Hells Angels had laid claim, and they had a beast that answered only to a 9-year-old girl. 2 hours later, Dempsey drove his matte black pickup truck down the quiet, tree-lined streets of Walnut Creek. Harper sat in the passenger seat, wearing her new, clean clothes. Havoc took up the entire back seat, his head resting heavily on the center console, watching Harper with unbroken devotion. They pulled up to a beautiful ranch-style home with a sprawling front lawn and a tire swing and an oak tree. Margaret, a kind-faced woman with Dempsey's eyes, was waiting on the porch. Dempsey killed the engine. He turned to Harper, a rare, soft smile breaking through his hardened features. "This is it, kid. No more rusted vans, no more cold soup. And no one is ever going to hurt you again." Harper looked at the house, then at the giant, scarred dog in the back seat. She reached out, intertwining her small fingers into Havoc's thick collar. "Can he sleep in my room?" she asked quietly. Dempsey laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the truck cabin. "Kid, I pity the fool who tries to tell him otherwise. The story of the Oakland clubhouse isn't just about outlaws and roaring engines. It's a testament to the unexpected places healing can begin. A condemned dog and a discarded child found their salvation in each other's brokenness, proving that sometimes the most profound strength doesn't come from violence or intimidation, but from the quiet courage to simply hold out a hand in the dark.